The ice came before daylight. Not snow, not rain. A hard, needling sheet of winter glass drove sideways across Clearwater Ridge and struck Mara Elwell's door until the boards sounded like they were being pelted with nails. Mara was already awake. She lay under two quilts on a straw tick inside the rock room beneath the bluff, and listened to the storm test every seam she had made by hand. Wind at the plank door, ice against the chimney stones, the low red breath of coals in the outside hearth. Then she reached one bare hand from beneath the quilt and pressed her palm against the wall. The stone was warm, not hot, not comforting in any pretty way, just steady. And that was the first thing the Elwells had never understood about the place they gave her. 6 weeks earlier, Gideon Elwell had stood in the yard of the main house with a folded deed held between two fingers, as if even the paper was something he did not want touching him. His wife, Prudence, stood behind him with her black shawl pinned tight at the throat. Mara's husband had been in the ground 12 days. Gideon said, "This is your portion." Mara opened the paper. 3 acres of ledge, a strip of scrub timber, and the old rock room under Potter's Bluff, a half-dug hollow left by charcoal burners before the war. No field, no barn, no proper house. Prudence added, "It is more than some widows get." The words were meant to sound lawful, almost kind. Mara folded the deed again and looked up toward the bluff. Everyone on the ridge knew that hollow. Boys dared one another to run inside it at dusk. Men used it for storing broken tools. They never meant to mend. In summer, snakes liked the shade. In winter, the mouth filled with drifted leaves and frozen mud. Gideon expected her to refuse. Prudence expected her to cry. Mara did neither. She put the deed in her coat pocket and walked uphill with her kettle in one hand, and her husband's buck saw in the other. The first night, the rock room was not fit for living. The opening was too wide. Rain had marked the floor in dark streaks. A fox had nested near the back wall. The air smelled of clay, old ash, and cold iron. But while Mara stood there in the dusk, one small fact caught her attention. Her breath smoked in the doorway, 10 steps deeper. It did not. She set down the kettle. Then she carried a pail of creek water to the back of the room and left it there until morning. The next day, the creek had skin ice along both banks. The pail did not freeze. That was when Mara stopped thinking of the place as a punishment. She began thinking of it as a rule. Nobody had bothered to learn. By the end of November, she had narrowed the mouth with split chestnut logs and clay chinking. She hung a thick plank door on strap hinges bought with the last coin from her sewing box. She packed sod over the lowest cracks and sealed the window slit with greased muslin. Then she built the hearth outside the entrance instead of inside it. Men laughed at that first. A fire outdoors, facing a hole in the hill, looked like the work of a woman who had misunderstood both fire and shelter. But Mara had watched the smoke. If the flame sat in the right cradle of stones, the heat rolled inward and the smoke pulled away along the bluff face. The wall drank warmth all evening and gave it back after midnight. She learned by blister, not by book. She learned which stones held heat and which split, which clay sealed and which crumbled. How little wood a room of earth required once it stopped losing what it was given. Neighbors passed on the lower road and saw her carrying clay in a flour sack. Jonah Pike called up, "A hole is still a hole, Mrs. Elwell." Mara looked down at him from the slope. "Then leave it empty," she said. He laughed because he did not know what else to do. By December she had shelves cut into the back wall and crocks of beans stacked in the cool dark. Apples wrapped in paper stayed sound. Salt pork hung from pegs where foxes could not reach it. Her bed stood on cedar poles high enough to keep the floor damp from touching the straw. And every evening, after the last flame burned low, Mara placed her palm on the wall. The stone kept account. Below her, smoke rose from Gideon's chimney. Prudence sent no message. No one invited Mara down for Christmas. The ridge had made its decision and felt clean about it. They had not thrown her out. They had simply placed her where they believed winter would do the work for them. Then January changed its mind. The first glaze formed after midnight, thin as varnish on every branch. By dawn, the ridge was cracking under its own weight. Trees bent until their crowns touched the ground. Fence wires sang and snapped. Ice-sealed gate latches, shutter hooks, pump handles, and doors that had always opened easily. The wind came next. It shoved sleet under shingles and down chimney mouths. It drove ice sideways into every gap men had ignored in milder weather. Inside the rock room, Mara woke before the storm reached its worst. She did not run for the door. She fed the outside hearth from the wood stacked within arm's reach. No more than needed. Then she set 3 flat stones near the coals and rotated them one by one to the threshold, letting heat pass slowly inward. By noon, the door was glazed white on the outside. By evening, the world beyond the muslin window had vanished. Mara moved her chair farther back and listened as the ridge broke around her. A limb cracked somewhere above the bluff with the sound of a rifle shot. Then another. Then a whole tree surrendered, dragging smaller trees down with it. Still, the rock room held. The clay seams wept, but did not open. The door shuddered, but stayed. The wall behind her shoulder carried a soft, buried warmth that had nothing to prove. On the second morning, Mara unbarred the door just enough to look out. The path had become a white wall. Ice had crusted over the snow so hard it reflected the gray sky like dull metal. The fence line below was gone. The road was gone. Even Gideon's barn roof looked flattened, as if the storm had pressed one white hand over the whole farm. Mara was about to close the door when she saw what was missing. No smoke. Gideon's chimney stood black and still. Mara waited. A cold chimney in daylight did not mean death. A man could be out of wood, a flue could be blocked. A family might be huddled in one room saving coals. But by afternoon, the chimney remained empty. That house had burned wood through every hard winter since Mara married into it. Gideon was proud of saying he never let a hearth go gray. Now the main house had no breath. Mara turned and looked at the room behind her. Dry wood, crocks of food, warm stone, a door that had held. The thing meant to starve her out had become the only shelter on the ridge that still understood heat. She wrapped her skirt tight between her knees, pulled on both coats, tied rags over her gloves, and took the iron digging bar from beside the door. Some choices do not arrive as mercy. Some arrive as proof. Mara stepped into the ice and began breaking a path downhill. The crust held her weight for one step, then betrayed her on the next. Her shin struck hidden stone. Her boots sank into freezing slush. She drove the iron bar ahead before every move, listening for the hard note of buried ground. Tree limbs blocked the slope. She broke the smaller ones, crawled beneath the larger. Once, a branch dropped its load of ice across her shoulders and nearly took her down. She stayed on one knee, breathing through her teeth, until the dizziness passed. Halfway down, she looked back. Her own doorway showed as a dark cut in the bluff, the only open mark in a sealed world. Then she turned and kept moving. By the time Mara reached the main house, her sleeves were stiff with ice. The back door was buried to the latch. She struck the crust with the iron bar again and again, until the sound changed from packed ice to wood. She knocked once. Nothing. She knocked harder. Something moved inside. The door opened inward, the width of a hand. Prudence stood in the gap with a blanket around her shoulders and another around her head. Her lips had a blue cast. Her eyes did not show surprise at first, only the slow confusion of a person who has been cold too long. Behind her, the kitchen was dim, the stove was dead. Gideon sat near it in a chair with his coat on, boots unlaced, hands tucked under his arms. Frost clung to his mustache where his own breath had frozen. He looked at Mara as if the storm had brought up the wrong dead. Mara did not step inside. "Get your boots," she said. Gideon's mouth tightened. Prudence whispered. "The stovepipe iced shut. I can see that. We burned the kindling box." Mara's eyes moved to the stair rail. 2 spindles were missing. Prudence followed her look and lowered her face. Mara said, "Bring what you can carry, nothing more." Gideon pushed himself up too quickly, and almost sat back down. Pride tried to hold him upright. Cold did not care about pride. Mara waited until he found his feet. No one thanked her. No one apologized. The storm did not require either. The climb back was worse with 3 bodies. Gideon slipped twice and cursed once under his breath. Prudence leaned on him until he began leaning on her. Mara walked ahead, cutting each foothold with the iron bar, then turning back to break the ice edge wide enough for them. The path tried to close behind them. The wind lifted loose crystals from the crust and threw them into their faces. Once, Gideon stopped and looked uphill with raw fear breaking through his anger. "How far?" Mara pointed at the bluff. "There." He stared at the dark doorway. For the first time since she had taken the deed, Gideon looked at that hollow as if it might be something other than refuse. Inside, Prudence stepped over the threshold and stopped. The warmth was not dramatic. It did not rush at her like a parlor fire. It met her slowly, touching her cheeks, then her throat, then her hands beneath the blankets. Her shoulders fell before she seemed to know she had been holding them. Gideon entered behind her. He stood in the middle of the rock room, eyes moving over the chinked logs, the stacked wood, the shelves, the hanging pork, the kettle steaming on the iron hook. Then he pressed his palm to the wall. Mara saw the moment he understood. Not all of it, not the work, not the hunger, not the nights she had lain awake while the ridge waited for her to fail, but enough to know the place had not saved itself. She ladled broth into 3 tin cups. Prudence wrapped both hands around hers and drank with her eyes shut. Gideon held the cup for a long time before lifting it. His fingers shook so badly the broth trembled against the rim. Mara did not mention it. For 2 days, the ridge remained sealed. They slept in the rock room with the quilts hung to make a second pocket of warmth near the back wall. Mara measured the wood, fed the hearth, turned the heated stones, kept the door clear from inside whenever the wind packed ice against it. Gideon tried once to go down for more supplies. Mara caught his sleeve. "Sit." He opened his mouth. Then the room was silent. He sat. On the 3rd evening the storm loosened. Ice began dropping from trees in heavy, dangerous falls. Each crash outside made Prudence flinch. Gideon slept near the door, his face turned from the fire. Prudence sat beside the back wall, one hand resting against the stone the way a fevered child rests against a mother's palm. She said, "We thought you would sell the deed." Mara kept mending the torn seam of her glove. Prudence swallowed. Gideon said no woman would spend winter up here, not alone. Mara drew the needle through leather. "No woman you knew." The words landed without anger, which made them harder to avoid. Prudence looked at the shelves, at the split wood, at the clay seams smoothed by a thumb, at the room that had been called useless because no one with choices had needed to understand it. "We meant for it to be impossible," she said. Mara tied off the thread. "It nearly was." Prudence closed her eyes. The next morning the sun returned pale and sharp. Mara opened the door to a ridge remade in glass. Smoke rose from 2 farms far down the valley where men had finally cleared their chimneys. The main Elwell house sat silent, dark windows glittering. Gideon came to stand beside her. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "I knew that hollow stayed cool in August." Mara did not look at him. "Did you? My father stored cider here once, years ago." Mara's hand tightened on the doorframe. Gideon stared down at the house he had almost died in. "I forgot the rest." "No," Mara said. "You dismissed it." The words stayed between them, cleaner than forgiveness and harder than blame. Gideon nodded once. It cost him something, not enough to pay for what he had done, but enough to be heard. When the ice broke and the road opened again, the ridge tried to return to its habits. It could not. Stories travel fastest when people are ashamed to tell them directly. By Sunday, Jonah Pike climbed to the bluff with a sack of cornmeal on his shoulder. He did not call the rock room a hole. He set the sack beside the door and wiped his boots before stepping in. The warmth touched his face. He looked at the outside hearth, at the angle of the smoke, at the stones lined beside the threshold. "Never seen a firework that way," he said. Mara said, "Most people look at flame. I watched where the heat went." Jonah took off his hat. That was all the apology he knew how to make. Others came in ones and twos, a jar of peaches, a coil of rope, a wool blanket with one patched corner. No one called it payment. No one called it shame. They placed things where Mara could see them and left before the silence asked too much. Prudence returned after a week with bread wrapped in a towel. She stood at the entrance, not crossing until Mara moved aside. Inside she placed the loaf on the shelf and rested her bare hand on the stone. "I lay awake here the second night," she said, listening to it hold. Mara waited. "I thought a proper house was walls standing above you." Prudence looked around the room. "I did not know a place could be strong because it was partly buried." Mara lifted the kettle from the hook. "Buried things know weather differently." Prudence gave a small, wounded laugh. "Yes," she said, "I suppose they do." Gideon came last. Not with food, not with rope, not with anything he could set down and leave in place of words. He came near dusk, when the thaw was turning the path to red mud, and stood outside the doorway with his hat held in both hands. Mara was splitting kindling. He watched 3 strokes before speaking. "I told myself I had followed the law." Mara set another stick on the block. "You had. That made it easier." The axe came down clean. Gideon looked toward the valley. "I gave you what I thought would push you off this ridge without my having to say it plain." Mara lifted the split wood and stacked it by the wall. "And when winter came," Gideon said, "I learned you had been building a house from the insult." Mara turned then. The evening light caught the edge of the bluff and left his face half in shadow. He said, "I was wrong. It was not beautiful. It did not undo a single cold night, but it was the first honest thing he had given her." Spring came slowly to Clearwater Ridge. The ice left broken branches everywhere. Roofs sagged where men had been slow to shovel. Fence posts leaned. Chimneys had to be cleared stone by stone, but the rock room changed in the eyes of the ridge. Men who once laughed now asked where Mara placed the fire. Women came to see how the shelves kept apples sound. Jonah Pike brought his grandson and made him put one hand on the back wall and one near the door. "Feel the difference," he told the boy. Mara heard him and said nothing. By April, Gideon had repaired the main house stovepipe and replaced the missing stair rail. Prudence invited Mara to dinner on a Thursday, not as charity, not as duty, but with a chair set beside the hearth before she arrived. Mara went. She ate stew from the same pot as the rest of them. Gideon passed her bread first. Prudence did not speak over her when she answered a question. Through the window, Potter's Bluff stood dark against the last snow. No one mentioned it. They did not have to. Weeks later, Mara climbed back to the rock room at dusk with a bundle of cut herbs under her arm. The ridge below had begun to green. Smoke rose from the Elwell chimney, steady and ordinary. At the doorway, she stopped and pressed her palm to the stone. It held the day's warmth as it had held the fire, as it had held her work, as it had held the truth after everyone else had mistaken it for waste. Mara stepped inside and closed the plank door. The hearth outside caught, the heat moved inward, and the place they had given her to end her became the place the ridge learned to respect.